a very great guest lined up. Without further ado, let me welcome to the air former WWF superstar Razor Rick Titan. How are you doing?
Excellent. How are you guys?
Doing wonderful, man. Looking forward to this interview, and I'm glad to have you on the broadcast.
Glad to be here.
All right. Now, my first question for you is, growing up, were you a professional wrestling fan? If so, who were some of your favorites growing up?
I actually didn't really start watching professional wrestling until I was in my teen years. So a lot of course, I grew up around Stampede Wrestling and a lot of people talking about that. And I was originally from Vancouver on the coast, the west coast of Canada. And then when I was 18, I moved here to Calgary, which is the home of Stampede Wrestling and still has a lot of that culture and quality about it. So mid-teen years, I was watching guys like Ric Flair and Ultimate Warrior and Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage, Sting, the Road Warriors. That group was my main group of favorites.
Nice. That's actually a good group to like to watch. Now, was wrestling your first career choice? If not, what was?
It really was. I was 16 years old, and I think I was watching Ric Flair and Ronnie Garvin, the Hands of Stone, in a cage match. And I was at my second-degree brown belt in a martial art called Aikido, and was watching it on TV, and we did a lot of semi-contact sparring, and I thought, I was 16 years old, so I was 6'5" already at 16, and I was watching these guys, and I thought, pretty sure I could do that. And from there on in, all I could ever think about was being a professional wrestler.
Damn, that's pretty impressive. 6'5" at that age, man.
Not the weight that I had hit later on in my career, though.
Now, during the time you debuted in professional wrestling, training was a lot different than it is these days. Can you describe your training to our listeners?
Training in the ring or training in the gym?
In the ring, obviously to prepare to be a professional wrestler.
Yeah, I think there was still, especially in Calgary, but I know in places like Texas and a few other places in the States that it was a little more hardcore as well. I had originally met with a guy named Daryl Murrin in Vancouver, and we got into a boxing ring that the old All-Star Wrestling guys had worked in, and it was a really stiff ring. So it was funny because I was fearless, and I'd done a lot of flying and throws and things like that in martial arts, so it didn't really bother me. And he said, okay, well, take a bump. And I took a bump. It was crooked, of course, because it was more like a judo bump, right? And then he said, okay, take a back bump. Well, that bump was the same. It was straight back. And he goes, get to the bottom rope and take a bump. So I flipped off, landed on my back, got back up, and his buddy was there too. And he goes, okay, go to the second rope. So I go up to the second rope, flip over, land on my back, and get back up and look at him and go, okay, what's next? I kind of knew the top rope. And so I climbed up to the top rope, and my balance wasn't great, but I flipped off. It landed on my back perfectly, and he was like, holy expletive. He couldn't believe it because I'd never been in a ring before.
Oh, wow.
And yeah. Just martial arts background, but I was a good athlete already as well. I played basketball. I could slam dunk a basketball, and pretty much anything I did, unlike my schooling, was pretty natural and effective for me. So that was another reason why I knew it was right for me to get into wrestling. And then from there, I moved out to Calgary, and I had this really lucky thing about me. I guess I'm kinesthetic and quite visual. I could watch, and I watched endless hours of videotape, not DVD as per nowadays, of tapes of all the top guys that were my favorites and all the way that they moved, the way that they did their body dynamics and how they bumped, and I could actually pretty much 100% of the time watch something on TV, get in the ring with somebody else, try it a handful of times and get it bang on. I almost didn't have to get trained really. Mm-hmm. So just a fluke, I guess, is a God-given gift maybe.
Mm-hmm. Now, you hear a lot of horror stories about the first matches of different people. Now, what are some of your memories of your first match?
I worked with a guy who still actually works in Seattle and Vancouver, Lenny Olson, or Lenny Sinclair, he went by at the time. And it was the Hart Brothers Pro Wrestling Camp was down in Okotoks, which is 20 minutes south of Calgary. And that was actually Keith Hart, one of the brothers, and another guy. And so he had a show coming up at a Quonset that he'd put on, and I think there were maybe about 50 people there, if that. And we had talked through the match a bunch of times, Lenny and I, and practiced it over and over again. And I didn't realize at the time, if you're sparring in martial arts, you don't have to memorize anything. You just respond or you react, right? And so you still get the butterflies, you got the hypertension going on and everything. But we got in there, and I almost blanked right out. So Lenny had to almost call the match for me piece by piece, and I remembered bits and pieces here and there, but I was so on edge that I screwed up a lot. We were practically like two dancers stepping on each other's toes all the time, And then at one point he drop kicked me, but one foot went way higher than the other, and he kicked me right in the side of the nose. So I've got this little fracture in my nose to this day still. And then the match just went to crap from there, but we finished it anyways.
Now, your first gimmick was as Big Titan. Do you have any memories of that character, and were you for it or against it when you were when it was brought to your attention?
What I had done is in Calgary, I worked as Rick, and I didn't want to use my real last name Bogner because it's just so easily forgotten and nothing too dynamic about it. And I always knew too that if you wanted to be a jobber, a first surefire way of being a jobber is just use a regular last name. Barry Horowitz comes to mind. And so I checked around, and I think it was just off a hockey stick. We had these Titan hockey sticks. You guys know how big hockey is in Canada. And the stick was called Titan. So I thought, okay, Rick Titan. And they called me The Titan, or Rick Titan in Calgary mostly. And then got invited over to Japan by Onita and FMW. Ricky Fuji got me in there. And I don't know if it was because Big Van Vader was so big at the time, or if they couldn't pronounce Rick properly with their R's and their L's, but they chose the name Big Titan for me. So that's how that happened overseas.
Now, Rick, speaking of Onita, your first title was the World Martial Arts Heavyweight Championship, which you defeated him for. Do you have any memories of winning your first title and wrestling Onita?
Well, it was a long match. It was good. And Onita was one of my favorite guys to work. At the same time, I was pretty young. I think I was only 21 years old. So he wanted me just to hit him with everything plus the kitchen sink and do my finishing move on him 3 or 4 times and kick out of it, and then had the Sheik do a run in and do his blade gimmick on him, and I mean everything. I may as well just mowed him over with the truck and hit him with a pile driver machine, and God, dragged him down the street by a rig, and I mean it was ridiculous what it took to beat him. But the fans ate it up; they loved it, and it worked, and it was cool just to win a World Heavyweight Championship.
Yeah, definitely. Now, of course, your most notable success came as the quote-unquote fake Razor Ramon in 1995 and 1996. How did that gimmick come about?
Well, you say my most notable success. I think that would be for the American fan, which it always was a dream of mine to have a big name in the States. I would have preferred it to have been my Rick Titan name and my own gimmick and character and style. But my biggest success really was over in Japan, working for FMW as a top star there for 3.5 years and tagging up with Mike Awesome, and then also being part of the NWO faction of Japan with Masahiro Chono and Keiji Muto in New Japan Pro Wrestling, and working with Hashimoto for the World Heavyweight Championship out there. Those were some of my, I was a draw then, and I made more money then, and the matches were more fantastic at that point in my career. But as far as the Razor Ramon character is concerned, I was in ECW, got called in. Sabu actually got me in there, and I was goofing around with I watched Scarface with Al Pacino, as almost everybody else did that ever watched wrestling, and I knew about the Razor Ramon character and how it got started. I liked it. I thought it was cool, and Scott Hall did a great job. And I just did little imitations here and there, which I still do stuff with my public speaking, do an Arnold Schwarzenegger and an Undertaker and a Hulk Hogan, and goof off all the time with it and reflect a bit of humor. But Paulie asked me, we're going to fight with the Dudley Brothers, and he asked me what I wanted to do, or here's what we're going to do in the 6-man tag, man. And he was all excited backstage, and I said to him, what the bleep you want me to do, man? And so he just goes through the roof, and he's like, can you do that out there? And I said, well, I don't know. And then he gave the walkie-talkie over to Shane Douglas as well, who was co-booking with him at the time, and asked me to say, hey, Douglas, you didn't think I was going to go down to Atlanta before I came here to kick your ass, did you, man? And Douglas stood up with his walkie-talkie, and you could see he was beat red in the face because he had all this heat with Scott Hall, and he couldn't believe Paulie would bring him in. And I just stood up and smiled and waved the microphone over, or the walkie-talkie over at him, and he just let all his steam out and came running over and said the same thing as Paulie did. Can you do that out there? And all the parodies of Stevie Richards and Blue Meanie as Shawn Michaels were really big at the time, so I went out and did my Razor Ramon shtick, and they called me Slice and Dice Ramirez. And really, it was just a joke. Bret Hart and I had been talking for a while during that point, and he had gotten me a tryout with the WWF, and it just so happened, or so I'd been told, that one of the referees was over at ECW that night and saw me do that and went and told Vince. And after I had my tryout as Rick Titan, he phoned me up and asked me if I'd be his new Razor Ramon, and he owned the character and the copyright and the trademark. I really wanted to say no. I wanted to keep my own character and not do that. I knew that it wasn't going to work the way that he was trying to explain to me that it would work. You just can't replace somebody like that. And we'd all seen it in The Undertaker and the fake Undertaker afterwards. That was a flop and a nosedive too. At the same time, I've been working my ass off in Japan for so many years and just dying to get into the States. I was tired of working overseas and the jet lag and the food, and I always lost weight over there, banged my head in doorways that were too short. I can go on and on. As much as I love Japan, there were certain things I just didn't want to be there all the time. And that was my opportunity to get in the States and make more money. So I said yes.
This is a funny story. Now, what are your feelings on Vince McMahon?
Well, I mean, he's a businessman, and a lot of times I've run businesses before too, and you have to be a little bit just calculating and not really too caring and things like that. Although I can combat that a little bit with how we do business here in Calgary. I'm part owner of the Business Synergy Center right now, which is for conscious entrepreneurs, and treating people with respect and empathy and empowerment, you know, building them up and letting them do their thing and fly with what they do best. I'm sure he did that with some of his top stars, but he didn't do it with most of us. So I've got some mixed emotions about him. You know, he could have been a lot nicer about things, a lot more decent. He could have listened a bit more and tried to work with people a little bit more on things. But, you know, he was the head of a multi-million-dollar organization. I guess he figured he knew what he was doing, and he clearly did at the time. And that remains to be seen over the next few years, I guess.
Now, Rick, did you ever feel neglected in the WWF due to the lack of originality surrounding your character?
I'm sorry, I only heard lack of originality there.
Did you ever feel a little neglected in the WWF due to the lack of originality of your character?
Well, you mentioned Vince. I'd like to transform the character and evolve it. Maybe it has something to do with a bit more of the Desperado movie with Antonio Banderas, slide it towards more of a Mexican kind of a thing, and maybe even to more of an assassin kind of a character, and get it away from what Scott Hall did, because I knew that nobody would ever accept it. The one time that I got cheered really, really loudly and blew my mind, I was actually in San Diego, but it was a real heavy Latino population out there. So just the character in itself and walking out with that attitude and the slick back hair and the cockiness and everything, the swagger, that they all just loved it and jumped out of their seats and were cheering and clapping and going nuts. And that was about the only time I ever really got something out of the audiences. And even as heat goes, I mean, most of the people, especially in New York, were just saying, you know, you suck and we want Scott Hall back and all that kind of stuff. Well, you know, it's not up to me to bring Scott Hall back, guys, and try and enjoy the character if you can. I was compared to Batman. They had Val Kilmer, they had George Clooney, they had Michael Keaton, all those different guys playing Batman, and people watched the movie and they knew, let's face it, Batman's fake. The movie wasn't real. Wrestling's fake. It's not real. I don't mean to insult anybody, but at the same time, maybe a little little lack of intelligence was going on there too. If a guy's working his ass off and trying to take care of a character that people are missing and is gone, maybe try and get into it. Suspend your disbelief like you do when you go to a movie. And at the same time, I understand. So there's a double-sided sword there.
Yeah. Now, speaking of Scott Hall, did you ever speak to him about being Razor Ramon? And if so, was there any heat between the two of you?
I don't think there was on his part. That's what I heard anyways. Triple H had spoken to him and spoken with X-Pac a couple of times, and he didn't really care, I don't think. He may have been unhappy with Vince about what Vince's idea was, but I think he understood I was a young guy trying to break into the States and make a name for myself, and I just took the opportunity that showed up. Really, if I didn't take that opportunity, I may never have wrestled in the States. I think if I had turned Vince down there, it would have been Vince's ego that got bruised, and just because of that, I never would have gotten into the WWF. I think he would have been pissed at me and never hired me after that if I had said no. And I think Scott was well aware of that. Not to mention, I mean, he knew that it wasn't going to get over, and him and Kevin Nash, and then with Hogan after that, went to form the New World Order, and that had a huge rippling splash on the whole industry. I think it's a historical moment in a historical group that nothing could even touch. So he was in that stage. If you were in that stage, would you be too upset about some guy copying you? I wouldn't.
Right. He seemed to be doing pretty well.
Yeah.
You were telling a story earlier about when you were in ECW and, you came out kind of sounding like Al Pacino or Razor Ramon, and that kind of leading to you coming into WWF. And so it seems like you actually kind of started that whole transition, because you also came in with a Diesel character who is actually the man who later went on to become Kane. How do you feel about your partner going on to such success?
Well, I think it's fantastic. I mean, at the time I was really disappointed, maybe even beyond disappointed, that I wasn't carried along with things. But there's a whole bunch it's a spider web of politics that was going on too. I don't know if you guys remember or not, because most people don't see it the way I see it, or the way that Phil LaFawn, or the way that Kurgan the Giant, or the way that Rambo from Montreal, who was a top star in Germany for almost a decade, who were all cut, or not cut, their contracts ran up, my contract ran up, and they were allowed to run up and not be renewed. And that coincidentally just happened right after Brett punched out Vince. So maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm reading more into the situation that's really there, but every Canadian that got on a contract that had anything to do with Brett whatsoever, as soon as Brett had his big schmoz with Vince after the Shawn Michaels incident, all of us were let go, or not renewed. None of us were let go. Our contracts just weren't renewed.
I didn't realize you were there that long. So you were talking earlier about after this, you returned to Japan, this time with New Japan, and joined the Japanese version of the NWO with guys like Masahiro Chono and others. How did that come about?
Well, it was funny because a guy named Tokyo Joe here in Calgary, Tokyo Joe Daigo, had got me booked over to Germany a couple of times, and he knew that I had gone over to Puerto Rico to work for a little bit after the WWE contract ran up. So he had gotten a hold of me somehow. Actually, I think he phoned my roommate at the time is what happened. And I'd called home a few times just to check out things and see how things were from Puerto Rico, and finally I'd called again. And actually, I think my roommate tried to call the office in Puerto Rico, and then I got a verbal message from them. The hotels that we stayed in there were so crappy, they didn't even have a phone in the room. But they're sort of extended stay hotels too. Regardless, I got the word that, hey, these guys are looking at you. You've been in the WWF now. You've got some big exposure. They've got their NWO group. You're an ex-WWFer, especially in the Japanese fans' eyes. Not to mention, it wouldn't have happened that way if I hadn't already made a big name for myself in Japan. I mean, I was in FMW for, like I said, about 3.5 years, tag team champions with Mike Awesome a couple times, heavyweight champion. I worked with Tenryu and War and WAR, and had a pretty good name for myself out there in Japan that people hadn't forgotten me. And then they saw me on WWF. So the combination of the two, the guys in New Japan office said, okay, we're going to recreate you a bit here and bring you over to our company, and it worked out quite well. I was a good fit for their NWO faction.
Now, what are your thoughts on the Great Muta?
As far as what?
Obviously you got to work with him, so just working with him and just outside of the gimmick, what are your thoughts on him?
This guy was amazing. He was a fantastic athlete. Probably, I wished the whole time that I was there that I could have had matches against him, because I was always tagged up with him, never got to actually physically work with him in that sense. And he reminded me of Sabu. I mean, the guy was so intelligent, so on the ball, had perfect psychology, knew exactly what to do, when to do it, and so light on his feet and so aerial and just so gifted that, I that's one thing I really wish I could have had the opportunity, is to get in the ring and have some great matches with him. And as a person, he was a great guy. His knees were almost blown right out even then. Mm-hmm. And he was walking around, hobbling around every day practically, and too many moonsaults, But just a good sense of humor, real nice guy. I have nothing but good things to say about him.
Now, other NWO Japan members got to go to WCW, obviously. Was there ever talks of you going over there?
There was a little bit of talk back and forth on things, but the way that I'd seen it was the WCW guys that were coming over to work with us for the most part were guys like Scott Norton, and he was over for a while, but he never really got over huge. Like we had Kurt Hennig over with us for a little while, Mr. Perfect Kurt Hennig, right? I mean, he'd gotten over huge in the States and was a real big name. And Scott, just as far as I know, never was quite the draw that Kurt was, and didn't have the push in the WWF that he did, and was an Intercontinental Champion a bunch of times. I can go on and on. A few of the other guys that were in there too were sort of trying to secure their spot or even get a higher spot in WCW, because there's such a rotation in there, and there was potential to move up in slots and become a bigger star and make more money in there. I really don't think they wanted to let anybody else get in there and quite possibly fit into a slot that they wanted. So I don't think there's any real support from the American guys' side for me to get in there, and I don't blame them. You got to look out for yourself in that business. And as far as New Japan was concerned, I think they're more concerned about their own welfare and what's happening in Japan. I don't think for them it was a reciprocal trade a lot of times. So they're going to bring over people that draw money in Japan and and get more notoriety. And they would go over to WCW in the States to lend them some talent, especially someone like Keiji Muto, who was such a big star as the Great Muta in years prior. So that's kind of the mentality of it, and that was the politics of it. So I didn't end up getting any really solid connections to go over to WCW.
Now, what are your memories of running your training school with the late Bad News Brown, and what are some of your fondest memories of the training school?
It was great, because when I first got out of wrestling, I had broken my neck. I had fractured hairline fractures in 2 places, which I write about in my book, Wrestling with Consciousness, and some of the things that are life-changing moments and epiphanies that happen to you as a human being. So I was pretty injured. I was could barely turn my head. My neck was a mess and had lots and lots of scar tissue, and my body pretty much had it by that point. Some guys can last for a long, long time. Other people, they just aren't built to last in that business. And so I started teaching. And for me, it was sort of, do a somersault and then take a bump. And I'd explain it, but I couldn't flip over and take a bump because my neck was still a mess, so I couldn't really show them. And for me, as I mentioned earlier on, if somebody told me to do something or gave me a video of it or said do this wrestling move, I could usually do that wrestling move. But here I had to really learn how to teach, and I was having a real struggle with it. And then Bad News came along, and he showed me from the New Japan Dojo style of how he was taught and how he would teach guys how to work. And so after a while, I would go, okay, well, here's a move, and in my mind, I could do the whole move just fluidly and without trying too much. But then I realized that students needed it broken down. Okay, here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps to this move. Let's try 1, let's try 2, and get them through the whole thing. In the beginning, I didn't have much patience, and I was actually ready to kind of fold a tent on it because I just didn't get why they didn't get it. And Bad News kind of taught me how to teach. And he can be a pretty intimidating guy, but we always got along really nicely. We never argued. Just had a good heart, and he became sort of a bit of a fatherly figure to me as well. So we got to know each other pretty good and really trusted each other and respected each other. And it was a really good experience. I miss him.
Now, who are some of your favorite people to work with? And opposed to that, who are some of your least favorite people to work with in the ring?
Let's see. Some of my most favorite, if I think about WWE, I really loved working with Owen and Davey. God bless their souls too. And can't really think of, I worked with Brett in the ring. It was just one time. It wasn't a real long match. He wasn't there to put me over. He was on top and he was getting a big push, so he had to do his style of things, and I was relatively new, so I wasn't really getting pushed in that match at all. And so that, to me, it wasn't a great match. Same thing with Stone Cold, almost the exact same idea during that era. He was getting a huge push, and here's a fake Razor, right? What do you do? And then, nothing terribly memorable. I had a match with The Rock, and that was when he was still a babyface, but he was about to do his big heel turn, which turned him into a superstar babyface. But this was the moppy-haired Rock. He wasn't really over at the time. So that match was okay, but it was kind of like pulling teeth with the fans because they didn't want to see either one of us win. They were booing both of us, chanting Rocky sucks and Razor sucks through the whole thing. So it was kind of comical, actually. I can think about Sabu and Mike Awesome. They were two guys that were terrific to work with. Rambo was Luc Poirier from Montreal. I worked with him over in Germany a lot. I really enjoyed working with him. Tenru is a good guy to work with in WAR. I enjoyed that. Of course, Onita, and worked with Sabu a lot. And if I were to say out of anybody at all, I'd probably say Sabu was my favorite guy to work because my size and power stuff over there really complemented his aerial gymnastic stuff. And we could put each other over back and forth in totally different ways, and it really worked with the crowd to take them on that emotional roller coaster ride.
Now, do you have a rib or a road story that you can share with our listeners?
Do I have a what story?
A rib or a road story that you can share with our listeners?
Hard to do with mentioning names, but I'll just say, long story short, we were in a hotel, and there were some girls overseas wanting to hang out with us in the lobby of the hotel. And one of the girls ended up getting quite drunk, and I'm not sure if somebody dropped something on her as well. But she passed out and was kind of left in the hallway, and somebody, and I'm not exactly sure who it is, had shaved off one of her eyebrows. And I was green. I was 21 years old. I think I'd been to Japan twice. And I was blown away. I couldn't believe somebody would do that. Here's this poor girl. She's got to be at work by 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, laying in the hallway at the hotel with one of her eyebrows shaved off. It was, you're trying not to laugh, but you're feeling pretty sorry for her at the same time,
Now, you just spoke about who were some of your favorite opponents in the ring. Who's someone that you really learned a lot from, especially when you were younger, that just was really helpful to you?
A bunch of people, really. I would say one of the guys that I learned the most from, and that's because he was so willing to share more than anybody else. He just He had nothing to hide. He wasn't burying anything. He wasn't trying to keep himself over, which, it's an industry of egos. That's another topic in my book that I talk about. It's getting out of that headspace, and you've got people coming up to you all day long, wanting your autograph, wanting a picture with you, cheering you in the ring, and you can't help but have an inflated head about that after a while. But then reality kicks in, your contract's up, or you get an injury, or both, and you come back to North American society, and people aren't returning your phone call anymore, and they're not really bothering with you, and you think because everyone's treated you so specially for so long that you're still really, really special. And then you find out, in the big picture on this earth, I'm just another ant crawling around in a piece of dirt, and maybe I'm not that special in the big, big picture of things. And it's a real reality check. It's really hard to pull your head out of your you-know-what during that time. But the guy that I learned the most of because of that, because of his lack of ego, was Phil LaFawn from the Can-Am Express. And he was in with Doug Furness when I was in WWF too, as a really excellent tag team. And they've been huge, huge stars in All Japan Pro Wrestling for Baba for years, tag team champions over and over again. And one time when I was just new in Japan, basically, I said to him, because Phil lived here in Calgary as well, I said, Phil, how does it feel, man, to have that tag team championship belt? That must feel so great. And he says in his French accent, brother, I asked Baba if he could put the belts on somebody else. I was tired of carrying this thing around in my suitcase. It's so damn heavy. And that's all he had to say about it.
Speaking of your writing, a lot of what you're doing now is your writing and speaking engagements. How did you get involved in that, and what do you get out of that?
Well, I actually started just before I left Japan. I started looking at some Buddhism, and then got back into Calgary after that and started looking into Taoism and studied a lot of that, and then studied under a teacher and a monk, actually, in Buddhism, and a yogi in yoga. And it's not just the exercises or the gymnastics or the breathing of it. There's a whole long philosophy on yoga, which is very similar to Buddhism. As a matter of fact, I think Buddhism is just a branch of yoga. But then also a lot of self-improvement stuff, listening to Brian Tracy and Anthony Robbins and people like that, and taking a lot of seminars and courses and trying to better myself. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a real difficult headspace with some of the anger issues and some of the self-centeredness and the ego that you have getting out of that business, being spoiled rotten for so long, that I wanted to really make a lot of changes with myself. And over the years, it's been a decade now of doing that. So for 10 years, I've been studying and practicing various things along those lines and systems, and started helping people one by one with a little bit of individual coaching, and then decided I want to sit down with a lot of these principles and share them from the old esoteric message, which can, when I first started reading all this, it was way over my head, so I understand that a lot of people just getting into it now, it's way over their head. So I wanted to give a real interesting message and come up with the concepts and step-by-step procedures and point out things that aren't so obvious to us that we can work on, and then go make our lives better and actually make it better for people around us too. A lot of people have real difficulties and challenges in relationships, and I can say that my personal relationships, even with my own parents, who I kind of alienated when I was in my wrestling career, they're all repaired. They're all so much better. And I can go through my day instead of being a cranky, miserable, achy, frowny, aggressive, self-centered, egotistical guy like I was when I finished wrestling, into being a fairly happy individual that welcomes other people into my life, and they get good energy from me, and they like being around me. And so I've recently started speaking on it in the last year as well. So the book is Wrestling with Consciousness, and of course the title explains that we have a struggle with our own minds. We get in bad moods, or we get angry, or we have attachments to things we can't let go of, and other things that we have an aversion to, or hatred, or want to get away from so badly, but then we question ourselves, how come this is so powerful in my mind and it's causing me all this emotional turmoil and struggle in my life? Well, there are steps to get away from those things. So that's what I talked about in that book. And it's only $19.95, and I've got the ebook version on my website, razorricktitan.com, for $15.95, I believe, right now, too. And I've got PayPal, so all it takes is a Visa or a MasterCard.
Okay. Now, what have you learned about yourself in the course of your writing and speaking that you feel really would have been helpful to you during your wrestling career?
Good question. One is a thing of egolessness, and if I, again, on stage speaking right now, I get up there and a little bit of the ego tends to come back, and I would say awareness, really paying attention to what thoughts or what emotions are bubbling up and are very subtle and lower levels. The easiest one is the first one, is anger. We can recognize that usually pretty easily, right? If we get angry, our blood starts to boil, our face turns red, our heart rate goes up. We even have the desire to beat somebody up, and you can recognize that one. But the attachment thing, which causes a lot of pain because we get so emotional that our bodies get twisted about it. We have this mental grasping to an old relationship or this thing that we can't have or this situation in life that, like for me with wrestling, I couldn't let go. It took me a good probably 2 years to finally tear my mind away from it and accept that my body's not going to do it anymore. And hey, guess what? There's a whole life out there for me to live. So there's steps that you can take on not being so attached to those things and also really recognize them, being your own watcher, your own person that steps outside and observes what you're feeling inside when those tumultuous emotions or thoughts come in. Because those are the thoughts that destroy our minds and destroy our relationships and our own happiness.
Now, how can a listener get in touch with you or find out if you'll be speaking in their area?
Well, the best thing to do, and I welcome anyone to do it, I answer all my emails, is email me at ricktitan@live.com. And it's also on my website. The direct email is razorricktitan.com. And first, I would suggest that the book is really inexpensive. I did that on purpose. It's got a lot of wrestling stories in it as well. And it also talks about how I overcame a lot of those mentalities and the negativities and things that really dragged me down. As you know, a few of my good friends have passed away, some of them from suicide, some of them from either drugs or heart attacks, which, who knows, it could be either one in that instance. Really bad situations that happened to some people that I really cared about. And I think that if they had been able to luck out like I did, or if they had seeked out a teacher like I did, it could be a little bit of both. They probably would have been able to steer their minds to a more positive state and, lived a decent life or a happier life and gotten beyond those things instead of struggling with them so heavily. I know after the business, I got a bit depressed too, and that was really hard to take, and you don't feel like you're anybody or you're not very special anymore and nobody cares about you and you're not capable of doing anything, and it's a lot of change. So one of the things I talk about in the book too is the suffering of change and how to handle that and how to get past it and get over it and move on in life and let go of old things that are dragging you down, so ricktitan@live.com.
I want to let the listeners know also on your website, razorricktitan.com, you do that regular blog, which, definitely it kind of gives fans a little insight to the kind of things you'll say in speaking appearance or things you might find in the book, just little things to help the fans get along.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I know a lot of people that used to watch me wrestle, especially in that age group, are going through a lot of transition in their lives themselves. And let's face it, we're in a recession right now in Canada and the States, all over the world, actually. And so a lot of people are going through some real tough times. And that's part of what I talk about in my blogs as well. Not to mention I've got radio and TV interviews on there that I think most people find a little bit humorous, but also get some information from.
Can we have a caller on the line? So I'm going to go ahead and put them through. Hello, caller from the 858. You're on with Rick Titan.
Hey, how's it going? Hey, Rick, I wanted to, you spoke a lot about your book, and on that note, I know it's a different line of story that's told, but I wanted to know how you felt about having some of the stories with you and Chris Jericho being brought up in his book.
I feel fine about it. I mean, you know, there's in Bret Hart's book, he has something about a real green Rick Bogner, and I think he brought that up in 1997, and I've been working in Japan since 1991. So 6 years later, I guess I was green in the WWF, but you have to always get the perspective on what people are, where they're coming from, and where they are at that particular point in time, and maybe how they may have seen things or perceived them and colored them in their own mind, as you know, opposed to how you might. So, but I think Chris is a good guy, and I can't see him meaning any harm in anything he does. That's for sure.
Yeah, I had one other question, if I may. When you were doing the fake Razor character, I mean, that was just so surreal to watch. I mean, the fact that they would even do it during that time. I mean, there's always characters wearing masks that they would, or doinks that they would have other people play it, but to have somebody, you know, do it with without that sort of, you know, without that guise. The one thing that kind of struck me, maybe not as odd, but I noticed, was that of the two in your pair, it was always you that seemed to be cutting the promos and talking for the tandem of the new Razor and the new Diesel, and never so much Diesel. Was that just more because you had more of a gift of being an impressionist, and Glenn at that time wasn't too good on the stick, or was that just a mere coincidence?
You know, I think you're kind of on the right track there. I had the Spanish accent down pretty good, I believe, and of course wrestled a lot in Mexico and had Mexican guys on tour with me in Japan all the time. So I learned a fair amount of Spanish as well while I was on the road. And I don't think he was real comfortable with it. I felt like, well, we both felt this way to a degree, that we were kind of betraying Kevin Nash and Scott Hall. So it's a little bit of a, like, man, should I really be doing this kind of thing going on there? And I also don't think that Glenn had maybe fallen into his character. He was a really good physical worker, but even when he worked as Isaac Yankem, he didn't really say too much, and maybe didn't know how to characterize things as much. I'd been going to a few acting classes over the years and done a few stints on TV and movies, and just real small parts, but maybe I was just more comfortable with it, you know. But now he's got the Kane character right down pat, so he just needed some work with it, probably. So I guess. Would
you be Razor again, you know, knowing that unfortunately it didn't quite pan out in the way that you would have hoped?
Yeah,
I mean, if you had to go back and do it again, I mean, is that the point I mean?
Yeah. I even have my own mother asking me that about the whole wrestling career. So my answer to that is I wouldn't change a thing. I did everything the way that I thought I should do at the time, and of course there was some negativity there, but I did what I had to do. That opportunity was offered to me. I'm almost 100% positive that if I turned it down, I never would have gotten to work in the WWF, and I think that was a great experience, and there are memories that I'll have for the rest of my life that I never would have had if I hadn't said yes. And yeah, I'd go back and I'd do it all over again then.
Wow. Hey, thank you for your honest answers, man. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Thanks for calling in, John. All right, Rick, I just have a couple more questions, and then we'll let you go here. First of all, do you have any upcoming appearance that you want to plug?
Well, I'll be speaking in Strathmore, actually. We haven't set a date. We're thinking probably in late January or early February, which is just 20 minutes north of Calgary. And we just did an event on October 23rd with Justin Sachs, who is Anthony Robbins' student, actually. So my three partners here at the Business Synergy Center, you can look that up online too, Business Synergy Center. We each did a talk on October 23rd. It went really well. We had a nice big audience. And so we're looking at putting some more of those together as well. But keep posted on our website as a company and then also on my website.
Okay, and do you have any final words for your fans?
Yes. it's so funny that during those years, I was so arrogant and full of my own ego that I didn't really appreciate the fans as much as I probably could have. And I want all the wrestling fans to know, and I think that almost every wrestler out there comes to this realization sooner or later that without the fans, we would have never been nothing. If we didn't have them booing for us, if we didn't have them cheering for us or paying for tickets, we would have never gotten up to the levels that we got. And also, at the same time, I want them all to know that every time I got in that ring, I gave it 110%, and that was because I love the fans so much, man.
And we actually have one final question. This came from our chat room, from Black Belt Brian in our chat room, and he wanted your opinion on how many years you would recommend a guy work the Indies for $20 a show before just hanging it up.
That's a tough one. I know I came to Calgary, and it took me about 2 years of working sporadically and barely making any money at all, and I was almost ready to give up. So just a guess of an answer here, I'd say give it 4 to 5 years, and also go with what your heart says and be realistic. You know, my mother always said, too, that she didn't want me to go into wrestling. She thought it was foolish. And that's partly because she was jaded on, just didn't like the business and didn't like anything violent. But my contrast to that at the time was, look, I'm 6'6", and I'm 275 pounds. I don't think I'm being foolish here. And so take a look at yourself and take a good hard look in the mirror and decide if you really got what it takes. You got the physicality, you got the athletic ability, and you really know that you're going to make it, then just go as long as it takes. And unless you're just physically too old to do it anymore, that's something to keep in mind too. And that comes with physicality and athletic ability. And just drive. Don't let anything stop you, or don't let anyone tell you any different. But also take a good hard look at yourself and evaluate everything to make sure that you're being honest with yourself and with that career.
Okay, and Brian has one more question, and we talked earlier about if you'd spoken with Scott Hall about and there was any heat with him. Did you get any flack in the locker room for being the second Razor Ramon?
It was mostly ribs, you know, just the guys kind of having fun. I'm sure they did it on purpose. The Brothers Grimm, they were called at the time, and one of them yelled out, "Hey, anybody got a disposable razor?" And then a bunch of the other boys turned around and said, "Yeah, right over there," and they all started pointing at me. So there you go for the rib of the day.
That's funny. All right, Rick. Well, I want to definitely thank you for coming on behalf of JT and myself, and I'm glad we were able to finally catch up.
All right, thank you guys. I appreciate it. It was fun.
All right. Have a good evening.